I don't think I did anything wrong. I just wanted a sweet moment. When he looked at our baby's face and froze, I thought he was being dramatic. But now he hasn't said a word to me in 3 days. And the papers on the counter aren't bills. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Liora Wain, and I don't think I did anything wrong. I just wanted a sweet moment to remember. When you've carried a baby for 9 months, you want the world to see the love that built it, or at least the version of love that looks good in photos. That's what I kept telling myself when I posted our first family picture from the hospital. Everyone commented how peaceful it looked, how lucky I was, how perfect Ethan seemed holding our daughter. What they didn't see was the way he stared at her face too long, his expression tightening, like he was solving a problem no one else noticed. He didn't say anything, just handed her back to the nurse and stepped out of the room. I thought he was overwhelmed, maybe tired. But when he came back, something in his eyes had changed. Cold, careful, distant. It's strange how a single look can turn pride into panic. Now he barely speaks. He eats in silence, works in silence, even breathes like he's counting seconds. I keep replaying that day, wondering when the sweetness turned sour, when a simple photograph became evidence of something I refused to admit. The morning after giving birth felt unreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life. The hospital room was full of soft light and the faint hum of machines. My body ached, but I kept smiling anyway, because everyone expected a new mother to smile. Ethan sat by the window holding our daughter, his posture too stiff for what should have been a tender moment. I told him to relax, to enjoy it, but he didn't answer right away. He just kept looking at her face, studying it the way he studies blueprints at work, precise and quiet. He finally said she had green eyes. I laughed because babies' eyes always change. He didn't laugh back. He said neither of us had green eyes, not even a trace in the family. I told him not to be ridiculous, that newborns look strange for a while. He nodded slowly, but didn't look convinced. When the nurse came in to check vitals, he asked her for an extra copy of the hospital record, saying he wanted to keep everything organized. She smiled politely, thinking he was just being a responsible dad. I should have known better. Ethan never asked for extra anything unless he had a reason. Later that day, while he filled out forms by the window, I tried taking photos. My hair was a mess, my skin pale, but the picture still looked sweet enough to post. I wrote a caption about new beginnings and endless love. Within minutes, people started liking it. My friend Tara commented, "She's a mini you." I believed it. I needed to believe it. When I looked over, Ethan had his phone in his hand, the hospital bracelet still on his wrist, typing something too long for a text. When I asked who he was messaging, he said he was confirming insurance details. His voice was calm, practiced. My mother came by with a tiny pink blanket and too much perfume. She kissed me and said Ethan looked pale. I told her he was just overwhelmed. She said all men get emotional seeing their first child. Ethan didn't correct her, just smiled politely and went to refill his coffee. He's good at polite smiles. He uses them when he doesn't want anyone to see what he's really thinking. That night, after everyone left, he sat in the hospital chair, scrolling through his phone while I tried to sleep. I heard the quiet click of the camera shutter and asked what he was doing. He said he was taking another picture of the baby for his parents. I believed him because I wanted to. I didn't notice that he took one of me too, half asleep and unaware. When we came home 2 days later, the house felt foreign. The baby's bassinet waited in the corner, all soft colors and hope. I thought maybe once we settled in, everything would feel normal again. Ethan unpacked with the precision of someone moving out, not in. He labeled drawers, stacked diapers by size, wrote notes on the fridge about feeding times. I joked that he was acting like a scientist raising a specimen. He didn't laugh. He said order helps prevent mistakes. I told him he was overthinking, that babies were supposed to bring chaos. He said nothing, but his jaw tightened. That first night, I woke up to the faint sound of paper rustling. He was at his desk, writing something in his small, neat handwriting. I asked if he could come back to bed. He said he was just documenting things for memory's sake. I laughed, said he could rely on my memory instead. He said my memory tends to shift depending on who's listening. I didn't know what to say after that. I turned over and pretended to sleep. The next morning, he left early for work, even though he was supposed to be on leave. He said he had to check something at the office. When I called around noon, he didn't answer. I assumed he was tired of baby talk and needed a break. I told myself good husbands get overwhelmed too. When he came home, he placed his phone face down on the counter and asked if the baby had slept well. I told him yes, she was perfect. He said, "That's good," and walked away. In the afternoon, my sister dropped by with groceries. She took one look at me and said, "Ethan seemed off." I told her he was adjusting, that some men just don't show emotion. She said men who don't show emotion usually show plans. I laughed it off. She always thought she was some kind of detective. Ethan started working in the guest room after that. He said the lighting was better for online meetings. Every time I went in to bring him tea, his screen would change. Once I saw what looked like folders labeled household, utilities, and something else I couldn't read before he minimized the window. I teased him about being so secretive. He said some files were personal. I said we were married. Nothing should be personal. He said, "Some things still are." Then he asked if I'd mind keeping the baby quiet during his calls. The way he said it sounded more like a rule than a request. When he wasn't working, he was cleaning. Not normal cleaning, methodical cleaning. Every mug dried, every paper stacked. He even organized our junk drawer, which had been chaos since we moved in. I told him he was nesting more than I was. He said he liked things to be ready. Ready for what? I didn't ask. At night, he'd hold the baby and stare at her face again. Sometimes I'd see his lips move like he was counting something. When I asked what he was doing, he said he was memorizing her features. I told him that was sweet. He said, "It's necessary." The word didn't fit the moment, but I let it pass. One evening, while he was out buying formula, I went through his desk drawers looking for the camera charger. I found a small envelope with our hospital photo printed inside, the one I posted online. On the back, in his handwriting, he had written the baby's date and time of birth, blood type, and a few numbers I didn't recognize. I told myself it was just a sentimental note. But when I looked closer, I saw the heading, reference. My stomach tightened. I put it back exactly as I found it. Tara called later that night to ask how everything was going. I told her about Ethan's distance, about how he barely spoke anymore. She said new dads freak out all the time, and that I should give him space. Then she laughed and said, "At least you've still got your looks if he loses his mind." She meant it as a joke, but it didn't land right. I stayed silent while she talked about her new campaign shoot, pretending to listen. After the call, I stood in the nursery watching the baby sleep. Her small fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. I kept telling myself she looked like me, the nose, the mouth, even the tiny freckle under her eye. But every time I tried to trace the resemblance, something slipped away. Ethan came in quietly, holding a folder. He said he needed to check the birth certificate for a detail. I told him it was in the kitchen drawer. He opened it, glanced once, then placed it back. His movements were too precise, too controlled. I asked if everything was okay. He said it would be. I asked what that meant. He said, "It means I'll make sure it is." That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the house felt louder. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the floor, the faint click of his keyboard through the wall. I turned on my phone and scrolled through the hospital photos again. In every one, Ethan's smile looked thinner than I remembered. In the background of one shot, his reflection in the window caught my eye. He wasn't looking at the baby. He was looking at me. By morning, I told myself I was overreacting. Everyone gets tense after a baby. Hormones, exhaustion, pressure, it all messes with perception. I made pancakes to lighten the mood. When he came into the kitchen, I kissed his cheek and said we should have breakfast together like old times. He said he'd already eaten. Then he placed his mug on the counter, separate from mine, perfectly aligned with the edge. I asked if he was angry at me. He said no, not angry, just thinking. I asked what about. He said truth, and how it always shows, one way or another. Then he picked up his jacket and left for work again. The rest of the day felt like waiting for a sound that never came. The baby slept in my arms while the house stood too still, like it was holding its breath. When Ethan returned that evening, he didn't come upstairs right away. I heard him in the guest room, opening drawers, closing them, opening again. I wanted to ask what he was doing, but I stayed quiet. I told myself he was adjusting, that we both were. Still, when I walked past his desk later, the printer light blinked softly in the dark. I glanced down and saw a single page in the tray, blank, except for a small handwritten note in the corner. Verification pending. I tore it up before he could see me looking. Then I went to bed and told myself tomorrow he'd smile again, that he'd forget whatever doubt had started in that hospital room. I wanted to believe it was just nerves, exhaustion, anything but what it really was. Proof that the first crack had already formed, and that silence would soon fill it completely. The next morning began with the sound of the baby crying, and Ethan already gone. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter that said, "Back later, don't wait up." Nothing else. Not even a heart or a dash before his name, just that clean, cold sentence. I stared at it for a while, then tossed it in the trash. Maybe he'd gone for groceries, or maybe he'd gone to work again, even though his company gave him more than enough leave. I told myself it didn't matter. He was adjusting in his own way. That's what people say about fathers. They need space to figure out their emotions. After feeding the baby, I opened my phone and started posting pictures. The hospital photos had done well online. Hundreds of likes, comments calling us a dream family. I wanted to keep that energy going. I took a new one of me in the nursery, holding the baby close. My eyes were tired, but filters could fix that. The caption read, "Home feels fuller now, grateful every day." It felt hollow, but it photographed well. When Ethan came home that evening, I showed him the post. He nodded once and said it looked fine. That was it. No beautiful, no proud of you, not even a smile. I joked that maybe he was jealous I got more likes than him. He didn't react. He just poured himself a glass of water and started cleaning the counter again, moving my mug half an inch to the left so it lined up perfectly with his. That new habit of his was starting to irritate me. At dinner, he barely spoke. When I asked if something was wrong, he said he was tired. When I pressed him, he said, "You're not the only one adjusting." His tone was measured, not sharp, which somehow made it worse. I told him he was acting like a stranger. He said maybe he was becoming one. I laughed like it was a joke, but his eyes didn't match the sound. After we ate, I took the baby to the living room to calm her down. Ethan stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes that were already clean. I watched him through the doorway, how deliberate his movements were, how he kept glancing toward his phone on the counter. At one point, it buzzed with a notification. The screen flashed bright enough for me to catch a glimpse of a name I didn't recognize. Just an emoji, a single blue circle. He turned the phone face down. I didn't ask. Later that night, he sat on the couch with his laptop open while I scrolled through social media beside him. I saw a new comment under the hospital photo from a name that made my stomach drop. Miles. He'd written, "She has your smile, Liora." I told myself it was harmless, but my hand still trembled a little when I typed back a quick reply. Haha, guess so. Ethan didn't say anything, but I knew he'd seen it. His eyes flicked toward my phone, then back to his screen. The next morning, he didn't kiss me goodbye. He just said, "Don't forget the doctor's appointment," and left. The door clicked shut so quietly it made me want to scream. At the pediatrician's office, the nurse mentioned the baby's green eyes again, saying they were rare and beautiful. I smiled stiffly and said she got them from Ethan's grandmother. I had no idea if that was true. When I got home, Ethan's laptop was open on the dining table, logged in but idle. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. There was a folder titled Archive B. Inside were subfolders with dates, each labeled neatly: hospital, week 1, expenses, photos. I clicked one at random and saw screenshots of my own social media posts, captions, timestamps, even comments. One file was a screenshot of Miles's message. The sound of the garage door opening made me close everything fast. My heart raced as Ethan walked in holding groceries. He smiled politely, the same way he'd smile at a stranger. "Everything okay?" he asked. I said yes, just tired. He nodded and began unpacking. He had color-coded the groceries: fruits in one bag, cans in another, baby supplies separate. It was too organized, like he was preparing for something. That night, he stayed up late again in the guest room. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of faint typing. The light under the door glowed for hours. I thought about knocking, but didn't. The silence between us had turned solid, something I could almost touch but couldn't break. 2 days later, Tara invited me for coffee at a rooftop cafe downtown. She said I needed fresh air and good lighting. I left the baby with my mother for a couple of hours. When I told Ethan I'd be out, he said, "Of course," without looking up from his screen. At the cafe, Tara was all energy and noise. She asked about Ethan, and I told her he'd been distant. She said men always get insecure after babies, especially when their wives still look good. I laughed at that, a little too loud. Then she leaned forward and said, "You have to remind him you're still desirable. Otherwise they start acting like you owe them something." Her words made sense in the moment. Maybe that's what Ethan needed, a reminder. When I got home, I decided to post a throwback photo from a company event a year ago. It was me and a few co-workers, including Miles. He stood close beside me, his arm around my shoulder, both of us smiling like we owned the room. The caption I wrote said, "This team built dreams." Within an hour, people commented fire emojis and congratulations. I didn't notice until later that one comment stood out, a single period from Ethan's account, just a dot. I stared at it, not sure if it meant anger or resignation. That night, he didn't come to bed. I found him in the guest room again, sitting at his desk, phone in hand. When he noticed me, he locked the screen immediately. I asked if he was avoiding me. He said he was just thinking. I said he was thinking too much, that he was turning our life into an experiment. He said, "Experiments reveal truth." His voice was so calm it scared me. The baby started crying, breaking the tension. I picked her up and rocked her gently. Ethan stood there for a moment watching. Then he said quietly, "She doesn't look like me." The words hit like cold water. I tried to laugh it off, saying she was only a few weeks old. Babies change all the time. He didn't argue. He just said, "We'll see." The next day, he took the day off work but didn't stay home. He left right after breakfast, wearing a clean white shirt I'd ironed weeks ago. His phone buzzed again while he was tying his shoes. I saw the same blue circle emoji appear on the screen before he silenced it. I asked where he was going. He said, "Downtown. I have to take care of something." I asked if it was work-related. He said, "Something like that." When he came back that afternoon, his demeanor was different, calm but heavier, like he'd made a decision. He handed me a small bag with my favorite pastry and said, "You should eat." I took it, confused by the softness in his tone. Then I noticed a faint smear of ink on his wrist, like he'd been signing something. That evening, while I was feeding the baby, I heard the faint sound of the printer again. The smell of toner filled the air. I walked toward the sound, but by the time I reached the guest room, the paper tray was empty. Ethan stood there holding a sheet of paper. When he saw me, he folded it once and slipped it into his desk drawer. I asked what it was. He said, "A receipt." I asked for what? He said, "For truth." The next few days blurred together. Ethan went to work, came home, cleaned, logged things on his laptop. I tried to act normal. I texted friends, posted another picture, even joined a mum's group chat online. People kept commenting on how beautiful the baby was, how much she looked like me. No one said she looked like Ethan. One night, my mother came over to help with the baby. While she cooed over the little one, she said, "You know, she doesn't have the vein features. Ethan was such a fair baby." I said genetics skip generations. She didn't argue, but she gave me a long look that made my stomach twist. When Ethan got home, my mother tried to make small talk. She asked how work was going. He said fine, then added that he was taking a few personal meetings downtown this week. She asked if everything was all right. He smiled politely and said, "Everything's in progress." After she left, I told him she thought he looked tired. He said he was just catching up on things. I asked what things. He said, "Documentation." I laughed and said he sounded like a lawyer. He looked straight at me and said, "Maybe I should have been one." That night, when I checked the baby monitor, I noticed something odd. The red light blinked even though I wasn't using it. I picked it up and realized the camera was tilted toward the desk, not the crib. I mentioned it the next morning, trying to sound casual. Ethan said maybe I'd bumped it. I wasn't sure. 2 days later, I noticed a calendar reminder on his phone when he left it charging. It read, "Downtown 3:40. I recognized the handwriting from his notes. My heart raced, but I told myself it was another errand. He always had errands lately. That evening, while he showered, I looked through his jacket pocket and found a small receipt from a courier service. It had today's date and the words "priority processing." I didn't understand what that meant, but my hands shook when I folded it back. When he came out, he looked fresh, calm, distant. I asked if he'd been working on something important. He said, "Something final." I tried to smile, but my voice came out smaller than I meant. "Final," I repeated. He nodded once and said, "Yes, sometimes truth needs signatures." I didn't know what he meant then. I only knew that the silence between us had changed again. It wasn't uncertainty anymore. It was certainty waiting to be spoken aloud. The morning sunlight spilled through the blinds like it was trying to make everything look gentler than it was. Ethan was already gone again. The bed on his side looked untouched, smooth as a photograph. I fed the baby while scrolling through my phone, trying to fill the silence with noise. My post from last night had almost 400 likes. Strangers said things like, "Perfect little family," and "You two are glowing." It felt good, even if it wasn't true. I told myself the comments meant something real, that everyone saw what Ethan refused to see. By noon, I decided to meet Tara again. She said I needed a break, and maybe she was right. She always said stress made people paranoid. I told her about Ethan's distance, about how he'd been working from the guest room and labeling everything like a file clerk. She said he sounded obsessive, maybe depressed. I liked that idea better than the other possibilities. Depressed was something I could fix with affection and patience. I asked if she thought it was strange that he kept going downtown at specific times. She said men in their 30s love structure. It made them feel important. That made me laugh, and for a while, I believed her. When I came home, Ethan was on the couch, laptop open, typing with the same steady rhythm that had started to haunt me. The baby's blanket was folded neatly beside him. I told him Tara said hi. He nodded without looking up. I asked if he'd eaten. He said yes. I asked if he wanted to hold the baby. He said later. His voice was quiet, like he was saving energy for something else. I went upstairs to change and noticed the printer light blinking again. I pressed the power button, but it didn't respond. When I opened the tray, a single blank page sat inside. I threw it away, but a faint line of text had been printed across the edge. Just a date, no explanation. I felt a strange rush of anger at the sight of it, like even paper was mocking me with secrets. That night, Ethan came to bed, but didn't touch me. We lay there like two statues in the dark. I whispered that I missed him. He said, "You miss who you thought I was." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. I told him he was talking like a therapist. He said therapists listen before judging. I turned away so he wouldn't see my eyes burn. The next morning, he took the baby's bottle out of my hands and said, "I'll feed her." His movements were slow, deliberate, careful. He studied her face again, that same quiet analysis that made me feel like I was under a microscope too. I told him she looked just like me. He didn't answer. When she finished, he set the bottle down and said, "I'm going downtown again today." I asked why. He said, "I'm following up." He left before I could ask what that meant. I watched from the window as his car pulled out of the driveway. For a moment, I almost ran after him. Instead, I called Tara. She said I was overreacting again, that men sometimes get jealous after babies because the attention shifts. She said I should post something new, remind everyone that I was still in control. I didn't tell her that control felt like something shrinking inside my chest. By afternoon, I had convinced myself everything would be fine if I just made the right impression. I put on makeup for the first time in weeks, brushed my hair, and took a new picture, me holding the baby by the window, sunlight catching the green in her eyes. I wrote the caption, "Some people search their whole lives for peace, I made mine." I thought it sounded poetic. Within minutes, people started commenting hearts. I saw one notification that froze me. Miles had liked it. I clicked his profile, and my stomach twisted when I saw he'd been posting too. A new picture of him at a playground, holding his niece. The resemblance was impossible to unsee once I noticed it. The same chin, the same eyes. I slammed my phone face down and told myself I was being dramatic. When Ethan came home that evening, he didn't go to the guest room. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, scrolling through something in silence. I tried to break the tension by talking about dinner, about maybe visiting his mother. He said he'd already spoken to her. The way he said it made me pause. "You called her?" I asked. "She called me," he corrected. "She had questions." "What questions?" I asked, even though I already knew. He looked at me then, his expression calm in a way that felt dangerous. "About family traits," he said. "She couldn't remember any green eyes either." I laughed because it was easier than crying. "Oh my God, you two are ridiculous. Babies change. They all look weird at first." He didn't argue. He just closed his laptop, stood up and said, "You're right, they do change." When he walked past me, I smelled faint toner on his shirt, that clean, chemical scent that had started to follow him around. I asked if he'd been printing things at work. He said, "Not at work." After he went upstairs, I checked his laptop. It was password protected now. He'd never done that before. I tried the usual combinations, our anniversary, his birthday, the baby's name, but none worked. I felt a flash of panic so sharp it almost made me dizzy. The next day, Ruth came by unannounced. She held the baby for a long time, studying her face with a strange kind of pity. "She's precious," she said. "I'm sure everything will make sense soon." I asked what she meant, but she only smiled, tight-lipped. Before leaving, she said Ethan would be spending the weekend at her house. "Just to clear his head," she added. When he came home later, I tried to act like nothing was wrong. I told him Ruth had visited, that she adored the baby. He said she always wanted another granddaughter. The way he said it, flat, unfeeling, made me snap. I told him I was sick of the cold treatment, that he'd turned into a ghost walking through the house. He looked at me for a long moment and said, Ghosts don't keep records. That night, I didn't sleep. Every sound felt amplified. The ticking clock, the baby's soft breathing, the faint buzz of his phone on the nightstand. When I looked over, I saw a new message appear on the screen. It was from an unknown number, the preview reading only. Ready for collection. I couldn't stop shaking. I waited until he was asleep, then opened his phone. He'd added a lock code. I tried 3 guesses before it locked me out. I wanted to throw it against the wall, but instead I crept into the guest room. His desk was covered in folders again. I opened one labeled Utilities, but inside were printed copies of emails. One subject line caught my eye. Follow-up confirmation. I didn't recognize the sender. The message was short, just a date, a time, and the words, "Courier arranged." My throat went dry. The next morning, I asked if we could talk. He said we were already talking. I said not like this. He poured his coffee, ignoring me. I told him he was making me feel like a criminal. He said, "Then maybe you should stop acting like one." The words hit harder than I expected. I told him he was paranoid, that he'd drive himself crazy with all this suspicion. He said, "Crazy is when you ignore what's right in front of you." The baby started crying again. He took her from my arms before I could react. He looked down at her, his face unreadable. "She deserves clarity," he said quietly. I told him clarity doesn't raise children. Love does. He looked up then, eyes steady, and said, "Love starts with truth." He spent most of that day in silence, making phone calls from the driveway. I heard him say things like verification, delivery, and confirmation. Each word felt like a nail sealing something shut. By evening, he was back at his laptop again. I asked what he was doing. He said he was sorting photos for documentation. I said it was obsessive, that normal people don't live like this. He said, "We're not normal people anymore." I laughed bitterly and told him he was embarrassing himself, that he looked like someone preparing for a trial that didn't exist. He looked at me then, finally meeting my eyes, and said, "It exists." He stood, walked over to the counter, and began aligning the mugs again, his quiet ritual. I told him to stop, that he was making me nervous. He said, "You should be nervous." His tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. That night, while he slept, I checked his car. In the glove compartment was a small envelope labeled in his handwriting. File A, preliminary. I didn't open it. I just sat in the driver's seat, holding it, feeling the paper's edges dig into my palms. Somewhere between exhaustion and panic, I started to cry quietly so the baby wouldn't hear. By the time the sun rose, I'd decided I couldn't live like this anymore. I would confront him, demand an explanation, force the truth out of him before it strangled both of us. But when I came back inside, he was already dressed, coffee mug in hand, calm as ever. "I have to go downtown," he said again. "It's the last step." "What step?" I asked. He finished his coffee, set the mug down perfectly in line with mine, and said, "You'll find out soon enough." Then he walked out the door, leaving behind a silence that felt colder than any word he could have said. The following weekend, Ruth invited us for dinner. She said it was time the family got together properly, that the baby should see her grandparents. I didn't want to go. The idea of sitting across from Ethan in his mother's house, while everyone pretended nothing was wrong, made me sick. But he insisted. He said, "It'll be good for appearances." That word, appearances, hung between us like fog. When we arrived, the table was already set, candles flickering too bright for daylight. Ruth greeted us at the door, smiling that polite, careful smile that never reached her eyes. She took the baby from my arms with a tenderness that felt rehearsed. Ethan followed her into the living room, leaving me to hang my coat. I caught a glimpse of them together, Ruth whispering something to him while he nodded. Dinner started quietly. Ruth served roast chicken, her favorite comfort dish, and tried to keep the conversation light. She asked about work, about the baby's sleep schedule. I answered everything while Ethan mostly listened, carving his food into perfect squares. Every few minutes, Ruth's eyes flicked between us. I could feel her measuring my words. Halfway through the meal, Ethan's cousin Levi arrived late, carrying a gift bag. He made some joke about being the fun uncle and leaned over the baby's carrier to peek in. Then he laughed lightly and said, "Wow, she doesn't look like either of you. Maybe she's adopted." The room went still. Ruth set her fork down. I forced a laugh that sounded too sharp. "Babies change every week," I said. Levi looked confused, mumbling something about just kidding. But Ethan's face didn't move. He just stared down at his plate, unmoving, like the words had confirmed something he'd already known. I tried to shift the mood, telling a story about the baby's first smile. No one interrupted, but no one laughed either. When I finished, Ruth reached for her wine and said softly, "Green eyes, though. That's unusual for both of you." It wasn't even a question. I said genetics can surprise people. She replied, "Only when they should." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her she was crossing a line, but I didn't. Ethan excused himself then, saying he needed to make a quick call. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ruth watched me with that cool expression mothers use when they already know the truth. I said Ethan had been under stress, that he was taking things too seriously. She nodded, too quickly. "He's always been careful," she said. "He takes after his father in that way." I took a sip of water and noticed my hands shaking. Ruth asked if I was cold. I said no, just tired. She said, "Tired people sometimes slip." I didn't answer. When Ethan came back, he looked composed, but there was something final about the way he sat down. He reached for his napkin, folded it once, and said to Ruth, "Everything's confirmed." She didn't react, just gave a small nod, as if she'd been expecting it. My throat went dry. I asked what he meant, but he ignored me. Ruth stood, gathered plates, and said she'd make tea. I followed her into the kitchen, whispering that Ethan had been paranoid lately, that he was imagining things. She didn't look at me. "He's not imagining anything," she said. "He's preparing." Her voice was calm, too calm. I told her she didn't understand. She said, "Mothers always understand." When we left, the air outside felt heavy, like rain without clouds. Ethan drove in silence. I stared at his profile, the way the light from passing street lamps cut across his face. I asked if he was angry. He said, "I'm past that." I asked what that meant. He said, "It means I've stopped reacting." At home, he went straight to the guest room again. I followed him, standing in the doorway while he opened the drawer and placed a sealed envelope inside. I asked what it was. He said, "Something you'll see soon." I told him I couldn't take this anymore, that his cryptic behavior was tearing the family apart. He said, "Families fall apart long before the paperwork catches up." I told him he was cruel, that he was punishing me for nothing. He looked up at me finally and said, "You think silence is punishment. It's mercy." I didn't know how to respond. I stood there, trembling, while he closed the drawer and locked it. The sound of that small click felt louder than shouting. The next day, I went to my mother's. I told her Ethan had become cold, distant, strange. She said men have fragile pride, that I should give him space. But even as she said it, she kept glancing at the baby's face, her expression tightening. When I asked what was wrong, she said, "Nothing, darling. She's lovely," but her tone betrayed her. When I got home that evening, Ethan was sitting in the living room. He'd shaved, his shirt crisp, as if he were going somewhere important. He told me he had a few things to finalize in the morning. I asked what kind of things. He said, "The kind that close loops." I told him I didn't understand. He said, "You will." Then he turned on the TV and started scrolling through channels like nothing had happened. That night, I lay awake listening to the soft hum of the printer again. When I crept toward the door, I heard him murmuring to himself. I pressed my ear closer. He was reading something aloud. Dates, numbers, times. It sounded like a list. Then the low buzz of his phone vibrated against the desk, followed by his quiet voice saying, "Yes, tomorrow morning's fine. Confirmed delivery." I went back to bed, my body trembling. In the dark, I tried to convince myself it was still fixable, that maybe he was just bluffing, trying to scare me into admitting something. But I hadn't done anything wrong. Not really. That's what I kept repeating to myself until the words stopped meaning anything at all. Ethan started leaving earlier and coming home later, always in that same pressed shirt and calm face. He'd stopped explaining where he went. I stopped asking. The air between us had thickened into something we couldn't move through anymore. Every word felt measured, rehearsed, like we were both reading lines from different scripts. One morning, he was already dressed when I came downstairs. He stood by the counter, sipping coffee, staring at nothing. I asked if he was all right. He said, "I'm fine. I'm handling things properly." The way he said properly made my skin crawl. I asked what that meant, but he didn't answer. He just placed his mug in the sink, wiped the counter, and left. I spent the day pretending everything was normal. I posted a picture of the baby, wrote a cheerful caption, and watched strangers type heart emojis. It didn't help. I kept glancing at the door, waiting for Ethan to return, wondering what he was doing that needed so much order. When he finally came home, the house was quiet. He didn't even take off his shoes. I asked where he'd been, and he said, "Downtown." His voice was calm, almost empty. I told him he was scaring me, that I didn't understand what he wanted from me anymore. He said, "I don't want anything. I just want facts." He opened his briefcase and took out a folder, placing it on the counter without looking at me. The label read, "Household." I tried to peek inside, but he closed it immediately. I told him he was being dramatic, turning our life into a filing cabinet. He said, "It's the only way to keep things straight." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the printer hum through the wall, the faint mechanical rhythm of him documenting our marriage piece by piece. When I finally got up and went to his room, the smell of toner still hung in the air. On the desk was a small note in his handwriting, "Bring forms." The next morning, I found him feeding the baby. He looked tired but calm. I tried to soften my voice, to sound like the woman he used to love. I said I wanted us to fix things, to start over. He didn't look up. "You can't fix something that's already been verified," he said quietly. I asked verified what? He didn't answer. When Ruth called later, her tone was careful, too kind. She said Ethan had stopped by earlier and seemed resolved. I asked what that meant. She said, "He's doing what's right." My hands shook so badly I almost dropped the phone. That evening, Ethan came home early. He went straight to the nursery, lifted the baby, and stood there holding her for a long time. I watched from the doorway. He didn't smile, didn't frown, just looked. Finally, he said, "She deserves clarity." I told him he was being cruel, that his distance was hurting all of us. He said, "It's not distance, it's preparation." I started crying then, telling him I didn't know what he wanted from me anymore. He looked at me with that same quiet expression and said, "I don't want anything. I'm just making sure everything is proper." He kissed the baby's forehead, put her back in the crib, and turned toward the door. "You'll get everything in writing," he said simply, then walked out into the evening light without looking back. The door closed softly behind him, and the sound of it settled into the house, like a full stop at the end of a sentence I never wanted to read. He called me to meet him in the lobby of a glass office tower. I thought it was a truce. Instead, a man in a suit handed me an envelope stamped with the court seal. Paternity results, official and final. Ethan stood a few feet away, calm, holding the stroller. He didn't look back when he walked out into the sunlight, and no one stopped him.